Module 6, Evaluating Instruction. Hi everybody, it's Dr. Davis, and we are going to spend this module looking at how we evaluate instruction with an eye to evaluate the curriculum. I realize that in many cases we see the evaluation of instruction and the evaluation of the curriculum as two separate things. Or what we end up doing is we go in and evaluate instruction, and then we use the test scores to evaluate the curriculum. But what you're going to find in this module is I'm going to provide you with not so much a model, but a plan for using the instructional evaluation to give you insight on what's going on in the curriculum. So that's where we're going this week, and our discussion, of course, will focus on that as well. So let's get started. And of course, we begin with some guiding questions to kind of structure the conversation I'm going to have with you this week. First question is, what are the strategies to evaluate instruction? Basically, there we want to look at how do we evaluate instruction. And by way of a little bit of a roundabout way, we're going to kind of look at what we're currently doing and how I think we can improve it with a different type of instructional evaluation. Now, I realize that much of what we do with instructional evaluation is prescribed, but I'm going to show you some things that you can add to it that will, I think, beef it up, make it a little bit more robust. The second question I want to address with you is, what do norm reference and criterion reference tests tell us? We've made such a big deal about testing over the years, and we are somewhat test-driven. So what information, what usable data do we really get from those, and how can we take that data and use it to improve the quality of our instruction? Because ultimately that is the goal of an evaluation, is to improve instruction. The third and final guiding question for this podcast is, what is the difference between the traditional and performance-based assessments? And so we're going to, I think, give you some new ways of conducting assessments. And maybe they won't be so new to many of you if you are familiar with some of the performance-based assessments that are out there now. Then this may be just a review to you. But if you're not really that all acquainted with a performance-based assessment, then this may be very interesting to you. So let's go on and get into the evaluation process. Well, evaluation of instruction is really the evaluation of teacher effectiveness, not necessarily their ability to teach, but how effective the teaching is. And so therefore, really, when we look at what we do with our teacher evaluations, oftentimes they really do not say much about the quality of instruction as much as they say about the effectiveness of the teacher. But when we evaluate teacher effectiveness by looking at student achievement, then really all we're doing is evaluating the curriculum. We're not really looking at what the teacher does, what the students have done with what the teacher has taught. And therefore, really, we're not doing a great deal of evaluating the curriculum. For the most part, when we want to evaluate curriculum, and especially the actually implemented curriculum, not the curriculum that's on paper, but the curriculum that actually ends up in the classroom, then we're looking at the mastery then of that curriculum. How much of it have the students really taken in and are able to do something with that curriculum? We're not looking at was the curriculum the right choice? Is the curriculum relevant? Does it meet student needs? Are the stakeholders satisfied? Is the curriculum meeting the school's philosophy and mission. You see, those are certainly important things to look at. And I would agree that we oftentimes don't look at, do the stakeholders like what we're doing? I think that while college and career readiness standards are here to stay, and Common Core, of course, is the vernacular for them, I don't know how much parents are really aware of what Common Core does. Now, teachers, you shake your heads when I say that, but the reality is the Gallup poll tells us that just a little over half of the parents know what Common Core is. And nearly the same amount have no clue what Common Core standards are. They don't know what this curriculum is or how it functions. And so I think that it's valuable when we consider evaluation that we not only look at teacher effectiveness, but we also, and mastery of the curriculum, but we also need to look at, is this curriculum relevant to our school, to our time, our place? Is it something that the stakeholders are supportive of? Those are certainly questions that need to be asked as well. Even today, we are still in the age of assessment. We assess everything, and we assess kids throughout the year, not just with teacher-made tests, but we're doing standardized tests throughout the year to see where these kids are. How are they meeting the benchmarks that we've set? And so I've put up here some words that relate to assessment, of course, evaluation and assessment, measurement and testing. And you can see the left-hand side, evaluation, assessment, those are process words. Those suggest a systemic approach for gathering data about how kids are doing, in this case. Measurement testing refers to the instruments that are used to gather that data. So we live in an age of accountability, and high-stakes testing is a part of that age of accountability. We are focused, we are almost frenetic on gathering data to show to anybody who wants to see it that we are making progress. And I think a lot of this comes from a place of insecurity that, while we may not want to admit it to ourselves, but the reality is that teachers know that the public, the stakeholders, the community, whichever way you want to look at it, they don't trust what the teachers in the schools are saying. There is a huge credibility gap between what the teachers say and what the parents believe. And so teachers are being forced to gather data so that they can prove beyond a shadow of doubt that these kids are progressing. And I'm all in favor of kids mastering the curriculum. Have no problem with that. But we are almost obsessed with the idea of keeping data to show that our kids are right where they're supposed to be. And so I think a lot of that comes out of this fear. But the idea of accountability is not new to teachers today. As a matter of fact, there have been 3 waves of accountability, and we're in that 3rd wave right now. First wave starts in really the latter part of the 1950s, around 1958, and goes on through, I would say, probably 1980, maybe 81. And really what starts that first wave of accountability movements towards schools has to do with the launch of Sputnik. And you'll remember that the Russians launched this 182-pound satellite in 1957, October, I believe it was. And all this little thing did was it orbited the Earth. It was the first man-made orbiting satellite. And what it did was, as it traveled, it just made a little beeping sound, and the Russians would track it and it was supposed to give them a moving target to track. It was not in a stationary orbit. It orbited around the Earth. And what was so amazing about this, and especially maybe so frightening to Americans, was that they had not been able to do this. The Russians were the first people to launch a satellite into space. And there were questions about democracy and communism. There was a Cold War going on between the two ideologies. And of course, there are those who believe that capitalism should win. It's the greatest ideology of the world, so they think. And so therefore, it should automatically beat the communists at whatever they do. But what they were finding is that in the latter part of the 50s, the Russians were beating us soundly in the space race. First to launch a satellite. When we couldn't even get our rockets off of the ground, they were launching satellites. They were the ones to launch the first man into space. Now, ultimately, we will win the race, but in those early days, it did a lot to deflate our ego. And people began to look for blame, and that blame was placed at the door of the school. Schools were not providing the right kind of education so that we could produce the right kind of student who could become scientists and engineers and mathematicians and whatever else is needed by the space race to beat the Russians. And so the government creates a mechanism where they can get some appropriations to funnel money to public schools to increase access to science, math, and foreign language courses at the secondary level. It was called the National Defense Education Act, NDEA. And that comes out in 1958. And it was designed to really beef up secondary curriculum in both the sciences, math, and foreign language. You want to know what the real outcome of it is? Not much. Over the 10-year period of this appropriation, it makes changes in the curriculum. Oh, we do see more math courses and more women taking science courses and math courses and more courses being offered. But does it really affect the outcome of increasing our access to American engineers and mathematicians? No, because in the latter part of 1970, President Nixon writes Congress a letter of great concern saying that if we don't do something about our public education system, especially at the secondary level, we stand to lose our place at the table of nations. And that's a paraphrase of what he said, but it certainly reflects the tenor of what he was saying. Lose our place at the table of nations. What have we been doing for the previous 10 years since 1959 to 1970? What's been going on? Well, it certainly underscores the fact that money is not the solution to everything. Then, in the early 80s, you end up with a new wave, beginning of the 80s, a new wave of accountability that starts with the Blue Ribbon Panel on Nation at Risk. And that report, of course, paints a very bleak picture, a 64-page long report. And it hits the front page of every newspaper in April of 1983. And it is big news. Our schools are failing. We have students who are graduating who can't even read the words on their diploma. And it uses language like sinking into a rising tide of mediocrity. That's what our schools are doing. And if another nation forced this type of education on our kids, we would consider it an act of aggression. Oh my goodness, the rhetoric from this report, but yet it was very successful. Terrell Bell, who was the Secretary of Education during the Reagan administration, was charged with the dismantling of the Department of Ed. He wanted to do away with it, said it wasn't needed, that really should be handled by the states. And I certainly agree with him, but the reality is that what we have happen is a new wave of accountability. And we start to look at what are the outcomes that we want our kids to be able to do and to perform. And then we design the curriculum accordingly. A little less than 25 years later, we have a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was originally passed in 1965, I believe. If it's off the top of my head, I think it was 1965. And that act, of course, was supposed to beef up our public schools, lots of money for poverty education, Title I schools. There were 10 titles that were addressed, and it dealt with different populations, special ed populations, Native American population, dealt with girls in sports, Title IX, as you know, professional development for teachers, which is, I think, Title IV. And so we have this reauthorization every 5 years. Congress demands it. So when President George Bush gets into office, George W. Bush, that is, in 2000, he sets to work to reauthorizing the bill and creates what's called the No Child Left Behind Act. That's its name. And basically, he is going to establish accountability for standards, and that if you don't meet the standards, you don't get the federal dollars. And so now we're living in a third wave of accountability since No Child Left Behind. Of course, President Obama has authorized the Every Child Succeed Act, and really that has kind of toned down No Child Left Behind, made some changes to it. So we've had three waves, and they're about every 25 years. Really, when you think of the early 1980s, that was 25 years. There, and then from the 1980s to early 2000s, almost 25 years there, and so we're in that third wave. Hopefully it's the final wave of accountability. But again, this is all about where we're at. We do evaluate. We love to look at how things are working, and then if they're not working the way we want, we typically end up scrapping them and starting something new. So it is the age of assessment, not necessarily the age of Aquarius. So let's take those four words from the age of accountability, age of evaluation, and let's look at them. And these are certainly terms you should know and be able to work with. I've already said that evaluation and assessment are synonyms because they deal with appraising something. They deal with valuing something, assigning a value to an item or a degree of accomplishment. And so we want to really examine. And that's when we do an appraisal, we do an examination of the thing that we are appraising or that we are evaluating. Not evaluating, but valuing. Measurement and testing talk about degrees of achievement or use of instruments. So there we're more interested in how much has the item increased in value, increased in usefulness, increased in knowledge. So there or decreased too. It could be decrease as well as increase. But here we're looking at assigning a number to something, a number that describes its evaluation. So obviously testing refers to the instruments that we're going to use to collect data about the progress. Measurement, of course, is just assigning a number to this growth and then making a determination or making some conclusions based on that number. there are phases that evaluations go through. And I've identified 3 of them here: a before, a during, and after phase. In a before phase, we would have a pre-assessment. Oftentimes, teachers will give a pre-test, which is supposed to set a baseline for the student performance. And oftentimes teachers will use this as a way to see what do students already know about the material that's being tested. And typically the pre-assessment is aligned to teacher-generated objectives, things that teachers want to know about what the students already know. And other cases, a pre-assessment may be a diagnostic tool to measure what knowledge the student already possesses. Now, during instruction, during the use of curriculum, we do what are called formative assessments. And these oftentimes come in the form of assignments and quizzes and projects, or even tests too. And we also have what might be considered informal techniques. We had formal just above that, but informal techniques where as we're teaching we ask questions, we have a discussion, and maybe even we're observing students who are interacting when they're doing partner type activities. The whole point of these formative assessments is to get a real-time understanding of what the student knows as instruction is happening. And therefore corrections can be made and changes in how instruction is unfolding, so that you don't wait till they get to the final test to find out that they failed. I was talking with a teacher just the other day, and she had given a test on a Friday, and she happened to be out the day of the test. But what ended up happening was when she got back to school and looked at the test, most of the students had failed the test. And so she was going to have to give the test again on the following Wednesday after a period of reteaching. Some of the parents were very concerned about the test and how that she wasn't there during the test, and that caused problems. I don't see how her presence being there is an issue, but she was having to retest that material. The after phase of evaluation is where we would see summative assessments that are given post-test, just like a pre-test, but now we're measuring mastery of the content. Typically, summative assessments focus on that cognitive domain, so we're not looking at appreciation, emotional growth over the course of the instruction. We're looking at what have they learned, what can they do with what they've learned. The idea with a summative assessment, though, is how are we revising the future instruction that we're going to do based on how students did. But what I like about formative assessment here is that it allows us to revise instruction right at the time that it's given, so that we make small corrections now instead of waiting till the next time we teach that unit. And I think that's a better approach, is to make the corrections to instruction now rather than in the future. But summative also allows us to make those kinds of changes to how we teach as well. Can teachers create norm reference tests? Well, they certainly can. Most of them don't, because they don't understand how these tests can be used. In order to create one, you really have to have a well-written test, and it's got to be piloted. We have to make sure that it actually measures what it says it measures. And then you need to have a group of students take the test, and you have to create a lot of demographic data about those students so that when it comes time to compare students, you are comparing the same students against a similar group of students in that first norming group of students. Is it really beneficial? I don't think so. I don't think it really is that necessary for you to create your own norm reference test. Basically, a norm reference test compares student achievement performance to another group of students who took the same test. Typically, we see norm reference tests when it comes to our standardized tests given each year or at the end of courses. That's how it's normally done. Basically how it works is you have a population, and it's a pretty stratified population so that we have all of the various ability levels and genders and ethnicities and races involved. They take a test and they identify the standards that the test measures. And basically what they do is they evaluate the test by the various populations within the population groups within that population who took the test. Usually then you see that percentile rank of how students did. And then when you take the test yourself, everyone after the norm reference group who takes the test, their scores are compared to that very, very first group that took the test. And periodically test companies will re-norm the test to see what is an average performance on this test. So how is an average student going to do when he takes test XYZ? Same thing. It applies to a test that you create. Now in the classroom, typically you have a similar norming process when it comes to test taking. A teacher who ranks the scores of the students from highest to lowest is really kind of norming a test. And this is because what happens is once all the tests have been graded and they've been ranked from highest to lowest, the one score that is in the middle of those scores, that becomes a C. That becomes average. Then all the other tests that are taken are graded in relationship to that middle grade C. So there is a way to do it. It's not standardized, but it is kind of norm referencing. Not very common in today's schools. Most teachers just do a criterion type reference test where there is a standard that's measured. So which of these tests is more valuable to an educational association, norm reference or criterion reference? Well, it really depends on what you're trying to do. If you have a limited number of slots for a program or for a university, and you want only the best candidates to be in those slots, then you're going to give a norm reference test because you want to identify the high achievers, and you want to know that the people you've identified as the high achievers are indeed at the top of the list. So typically universities that have scholarships and you have to score a certain score to get that scholarship, they want to identify the best of the best. But if you're interested in the content and whether a student has mastered the content or not, then a criterion reference test is important. Because remember that criterion, it tells you right there in the name of the test, that it measures you against a standard, a content standard. Norm referenced measures you against the performance of another student, not against the content. Did you do as well as 91% of the students who took this test? If your percentile rank is 92%, that means you scored higher than 92% of the students that took that test. So if it is important to know how many students have mastered the content, then you need to give a test that measures or is aligned with those standards. This is almost never done, but evaluating students, or evaluating instruction, I should say, based on the domains that are covered is an interesting way of looking at student performance. Affective is probably the most impossible one to measure. It's almost impossible to measure. Typically, it's done by observation because we're looking at feelings, values, and attitudes. And it's difficult to capture those on a survey because survey data is very unreliable. So the affective domain really is one that we don't measure because it's just there are not instruments to capture that kind of data. Now, psychomotor, we can look at the student doing a particular activity, dribbling a basketball, that we can observe them, and it's a teacher-based judgment. There isn't a scale that you can say, okay, well, this is subjective. It is pretty much objective. You don't have those objective measures. You typically have the subjective, the teacher's measuring, or there is a time limit. How many times can you dribble the ball in 60 seconds? Or it may be, can you walk across a balance beam? Who can do it the fastest? Again, there may be some standardization there, but typically your PE classes where you're going to measure the performance of skill. Although I know in chemistry you have some aspect of measuring skills, watching them do the skill, perform the required skill as well. Most often, though, we evaluate instruction by looking at the cognitive domain. What have the students learned? And what, not only what do they remember, but what can they apply from what they remember? That seems to be where most of our assessments go. We don't create those hands-on assessments that would cover psychomotor. And really, I think if we want a better picture of what a student has learned, we need to start combining these domains together, not only measuring cognitive growth, but also can they take that cognitive information and apply it to a skill and solve a problem that requires them to use their hands or movement of some kind. Again, the more of these domains you bring into the evaluation, the more complete the evaluation is, and to me, the better the evaluation is. It probably should go without saying that there are other forms of evaluation, and we sometimes use them, sometimes we don't. There are authentic assessments, what we call performance-based assessments. The literature calls these real-life tasks. So I've given you some samples over here on the right-hand side of the screen. So when we do oral interviews with you as future leadership students, we are doing an authentic assessment. When you have to sit through an interview for an assistant principal's position, that is an authentic assessment. Teachers who use story retelling as a way to measure student learning, that's an authentic assessment. When we gather writing samples using a writing prompt, we are giving you an opportunity to do a performance to show what you know. Obviously, projects and like science fair exhibitions are great ways to measure a student's ability with a task that has value in the real world. Filling out a worksheet has no value in the real world because you very rarely have to fill out worksheets as a part of your job. Now, you might have to create reports where you have to write something, or you may have to give an oral briefing like a story retelling, but very rarely do you fill out worksheets with problems on them as a part of an evaluation. So these can be some ways to bring some real-world relevance to your classroom and to how you assess student performance. There are alternative, and these are assessments that are project-based, but not necessarily a hands-on or performance-based. So I've given you three here, and these come from typically history and English disciplines. So, for instance, let's say that you are studying Edgar Allan Poe. And obviously this would be something that you might do in an elementary classroom or maybe a a junior high classroom, but have the students design a bookmark that's devoted to Edgar Allan Poe, that talks about the books he wrote and the things he wrote about and things that are unusual about that man. When you cover famous people in history, I've seen teachers who use a wanted poster as a sample, where they have the picture of the person, and the wanted poster tells about who they are. Again, it allows for creativity, and that is really what makes alternative assessment so valuable, is that it allows the student to be creative. And they don't have enough of that in schools. So these are just a few. There are many more. You can just look up online under alternative assessments and or project-based assessments, and you will find just tons of them out there that you can use. So again, these are just some examples of other ways to evaluate student learning. Now let's look at evaluating the curriculum. We have spent the last 20 or 30 minutes looking at how we evaluate instruction, and really I wasn't going to go into a great deal of detail about the instructional assessments that we use to measure our effectiveness in the classroom, but I wanted to kind of give you that overview of kind of the philosophy behind what we're doing when we evaluate one's instruction. But the tools that we use to evaluate instruction are very different from the tools that we use to evaluate the curriculum. And so in this second section, we're going to take some time to look at how one evaluates curriculum. And the underlying premise here is that one should be evaluating curriculum on a regular basis, and that's what we're going to look at in this section. There are two purposes for curriculum evaluation that I've identified here, and probably there are others that could be developed, but these are broad, overarching purposes. So when we look at evaluating the curriculum, we have an identification purpose in mind. We want to take a look at what needs to be changed, and change from the standpoint of how can we do this better. There is no one best curriculum. So it is a process of fixing it, basically. We start with a curriculum, and then we adjust it, we tweak it, we modify it to make it better. And the idea is that we can always make it a little bit better. And so when we do an evaluation, we're looking at the entire curriculum from beginning to end, and in that we want to find out what's working really well, and that is part of it, not just what's not working, but what is already working, and that is a great reward. Say, wow, this part of the program is really working well, but this aspect of the curriculum is not, and then we then can look at how to make that area better. The second purpose of a curriculum evaluation is to gather data that we're going to use to justify making changes. I have found that many curriculums get installed in the schools, or a portion of the curriculum gets installed in a school. And then the test data comes out after a year or two of looking at that test data, and we decide that the curriculum is no longer functioning, and we find something else. Or we hear about a new spelling curriculum, a new math curriculum, and it really seems to have a great impact on students who are struggling, and so we adopt that curriculum and we add it to the repertoire. Now everyone's going to do this math curriculum, and we're somehow going to marry the new curriculum with the old. But do we really have enough data on which to justify the change or the improvement? And in many cases we don't. It's here 1 year and then gone in 2. And that creates a lot of distress on the faculty, because they're not part of the selection process always, nor are they included in the decision to remove it. So they kind of just like, wow, what happened? We were doing this and now we're not doing it anymore. And so when we evaluate curriculum, we take a real purposeful step to look at it holistically and what needs to be changed is then identified, and we have the data on which to make the change, and that data is shared with people that are concerned about what's going on in the schools, our stakeholders within the school as those without. So really that's why we're undertaking this review of how we evaluate curriculum, is to understand that the two main purposes are to identify what needs to be changed and then have a valid reason with data supporting it as for making that change. You've probably heard the expression, "I'm up to my neck in alligators," and that connotes the idea that we are in a swamp and we're surrounded by alligators. And evaluation many times can be like that. We are surrounded with pitfalls that are part of the evaluation process, and people don't like evaluations. They resist them, or they become very nervous when they take place. And here are some of the reasons as to why. In many cases, evaluations yield limited evidence. The evidence that is provided is not detailed enough, so that people are not sure why they're making the changes they're making. Well, the evaluation said we need to make these changes. Well, there's not enough evidence to make a valid decision, and so there's concerns about the quality of the evaluation. Unfortunately, many evaluations are not systematic. They're haphazard. We kind of do these informal evaluations, and there are no controls put in place to be sure that we are really measuring what we say we are measuring, or what is important to be measured. So certainly there's a systematic concern about evaluations. And really, these evaluations, when it comes to them being systematic, much of it is due to the fact that we don't schedule them in a routine way. We just undertake them periodically, or because someone has told us, who's further up the ladder of accountability, that it must be done. So we don't have a schedule of evaluating, and we don't set in that schedule, we're going to evaluate these aspects of the curriculum each time, so that we begin to see a picture of what's really going on with the curriculum. Yes, and thirdly, many evaluations are very complicated. It's hard to understand what's actually being measured, what data is actually being gathered, and how is the data being analyzed. In many cases, it's just a textual analysis of, the scores went up or the scores went down, and that's it. And so in some cases, it's not very complicated. But in many cases, the evaluation is too complicated because of the statistical tests that are used, and the reporting is in jargon that many teachers and stakeholders don't understand. And some of that is on purpose, and some of that is just the nature of the evaluation itself. So evaluations tend to get a bad reputation because they are perceived as being very complicated, and only certain people can do them. You must have a degree in evaluation in order to conduct them and to be able to report on your findings. Number 4, evaluation training is often not provided, and therefore there's a need for people to be taught how to do it. It is not something that is intuitive. It does require some knowledge of how to collect data, how to analyze the data, and then how to present it so people can understand what's actually going on. So many of the districts don't provide the training that's needed. There aren't many places one can go to get it. Many times, if you have a university nearby, you certainly can find people there who might have knowledge of evaluation, but I would be the first to tell you that this is not common knowledge, and it does require somebody who has had specialized training in order to do that. Number 5, just as training is needed, evaluations don't do themselves. It does require someone who knows how to do this. And so if your district is fortunate enough to have someone who can do an evaluation, that's great, but many districts don't, and therefore it becomes a real burden to people, because it's not only an extra thing that they have to do, it's also this thing that they may not truly understand, and so they're kind of just going blindly along, hoping that they're doing it exactly the way it's supposed to be done. Lastly, number 6 is that evaluations do take time. They can't be done in a short period. If you're going to do them right and do a thorough evaluation, it's something that's going to take some time. Also, it's going to take your energy, and you're going to be teaching probably when you're doing this, or as a leader, you're going to be part of this process, and it is going to be a real consuming whole, as it were, to do this. But it's part of the job. It's part of what needs to be done so that we know that our curriculum is being effectively implemented and that it's having the results that it was intended to have. Lastly, as a part of the same thing, time and energy consuming, is that evaluations are expensive, because in many cases you do have to hire someone from the outside to get that person to at least analyze the data. Maybe it's not collecting the data, but it's analyzing the data. So these are some of the common problems that people have with evaluations. All of these are problems that can be dealt with, but again, it does take someone who can work through each of these issues so that you come up with an evaluation that's very valid. When you think about schools doing evaluations, there are 2 basic ideas that come to mind. First and foremost is that schools do not do a thorough job. I remember talking with a principal about how she gathered data for the annual continuous improvement process report, and she said what she does is she has this box on which she's written the word data, and everything that relates to continuous improvement she just drops in the box. And I said, well, what's the rhyme or reason for getting into the box? He said, well, if it looks like it's something I'm going to need information on, I put it in there. And then later I sort it out as to whether I need it or I don't. Yeah. A lot of times we miss important pieces of data that we need for our evaluation, and so it doesn't get reflected in the report. Other times we put in things that are not needed at all, and we count it as part of the process. So schools don't do a very thorough job of evaluating their own programs. And I say that also from the standpoint that many programs don't get evaluated on a regular basis. Only when there are identified problems do they conduct an evaluation, or they just decide, well, if they've got problems, we need to stop doing what we're doing. Secondly, we find that when it comes to evaluations, what is produced is not always very helpful. It doesn't provide us a lot of information about what's actually going on, because I don't think that the data may necessarily be valid data, or it's not collected in a systematic way. So I can see why there's a lot of question about schools evaluating themselves and their programs. And again, I think that this comes back from a lack of understanding of what evaluation is and how it's supposed to be done. Daniel Stufflebeam has, I think, crystallized what the concern about evaluation really is in his 8 symptoms of evaluation. And he says, first of all, people avoid evaluations or those on-site visits by the Department of Education. And the reason is because evaluation is painful. Nobody likes to have their lives kind of torn up and inspected by outsiders, and it's painful to show everything that you're doing and have people critique it, and maybe something that you really like and you think you're doing well, they look at it and say, oh my goodness, this is terrible, this has got to change. Evaluations cause anxiety. A lot of that is because no one really truly understands the process and what's going on with the process. So there's a lot of ambiguity with it. And so people, when it is unknown what's going on, they tend to get nervous. Another aspect of evaluation is immobilization. And this immobilization is this just kind of deer in the headlights look at evaluation. Much of this freezing and standing still is because they ask questions about what's going on, but they don't get meaningful responses to them. People ask about, well, what's going on with this program? Is the program working or not? And then there's kind of this, frozen icicle kind of statue in the response. And so people are concerned about this evaluation as if it's going to stop everything that they're doing. There is some skepticism about evaluations. Why even make a plan when what we're setting out to do can't be done anyway? They come in with a defeatist attitude. I don't know where that necessarily comes from, but it certainly is an attitude that many people have. We've already mentioned that there is a lack of guidelines, and I'm not talking about evaluation, but there's a concern about guidelines for instruction. Does your school have an instructional manual that indicates how we should teach? I haven't found one yet in a school. And so many teachers, they know how to teach. They just go in there and they do it. But has anyone documented how instruction is supposed to take place in a classroom? As far as I know, they don't. And so really when evaluation happens, people are concerned from the standpoint of they're thinking they may be measured, their program may be measured by a manual that they don't know. It's a rubric that they don't know exists, and so therefore they're not sure how they're being evaluated. And that causes, of course, anxiety and frustration as well, because to be measured by a ruler that you can't see is not only unfair, it's very unnerving. Well, there's certainly some misadvice as a part of evaluation, that consultants are brought in and they're told one thing and they tell the administration something and the administration tells the teachers something else. And so there's a lot of bad advice out there. I would hope it doesn't happen often, but I can see how it can. I've been a consultant to schools and their programs, and you give them what you think is good advice, but if they haven't told you everything there is to know in order to make that decision and give them that advice, you can end up giving them very, very bad advice. Also, number 7 is that what we get as a result of the evaluation process doesn't seem to give any significant difference. Basically, things have not changed very much. And of course, people who want to see an evaluation are anticipating that there's going to be some indication that things are going really great or they're going really bad and we need to change it. But oftentimes they're just not. Well, some of that is due to the fact that we haven't collected enough data over a long enough period of time to see the impact of the program on student learning. And so much of the problem we have is because of how we have designed evaluation, that it should be done twice a year or once a year at best. And so we don't see a great deal of growth, and therefore we think, oh, well, there must be something wrong with the evaluation. No, it's just we haven't had enough time to see the growth. Growth takes time, and impact takes time, and not everything that we start is going to have immediate impact. It may take a while to get out there. I remember reading a book about educational reform, and it was talking about the fact that it takes 25 years for most educational reforms to thoroughly impact the organization, which means that, boy, if we're looking at education reform 25 years ago, we're talking about the 90s. So we're not really, really prepared for that long of a time period for an impact from a program. Matter of fact, we don't keep programs long enough to maybe see the full effect. If indeed that 25-year figure is accurate, and let's say that for sake of argument it's not, let's say that it's 5 years or 7 years. Wow, we don't even keep programs that long. If a program that our curriculum especially, if we keep a curriculum for 3 years, that's considered a long time. And even then, we don't, I don't think, keep it long enough to see a real benefit from. Oh, we see some marginal things, but I don't think we see enough impact because we just don't wait long enough. So significant difference is an issue. Well, another challenge to evaluations are that we oftentimes don't get all of the elements measured, or we don't measure the correct elements. There are some things that we need to measure, and we measure them, and that's great. But there are other things that need to be measured we don't measure because they're very difficult to measure, or maybe even impossible to measure. And so because of that, we don't necessarily get a full picture of what's really going on. And that can be a problem for people who are conducting evaluations or people who are reading the reports of the evaluation, is that we just don't know. And there are people who struggle with not knowing. So these are just some 8 elements that David Daniel Stufflebeam has observed in relation to the problems people have with conducting evaluations. So when we look at instructional evaluation, here's what we're looking at. We're looking at how effective the teacher is in conveying information, managing the classroom, assessing student learning. And then we're looking at the student learning. Are the students meeting the standards? Are they benchmarking when they're supposed to? And basically, we look at the instructional side of what's happening in the school. Then there's the curricular evaluation side of this process, which looks at the content. Is it being conveyed? We're looking at the degree of implementation of the curriculum, how much is being implemented, are the standards being met. We look at the degree of alignment between the curriculum and the state standards. So we're looking at 2 very different things when we conduct an instructional evaluation, when we conduct a curriculum evaluation. But the question that I ponder here is, can we still have effective instruction while having deficits in the curriculum? Interesting question from the standpoint of, if we have some problems with the curriculum, how does that impact instruction? Well, what I have found is that when there are deficits in the curriculum, oftentimes that is when the teacher has to supplement. You'll hear teachers say, I'm supplementing the curriculum today because it really doesn't address this concept very well, or the students don't seem to understand it, so I'm providing this extra material for the students. So it would suggest to you that maybe we can't have effective instruction if there are deficits in the curriculum, because teachers are having to scrounge, maybe is the right word, to find ways to beef up the curriculum. I would submit to you that you still can have very effective instruction, even with curricular gaps, because great teachers are going to find ways to fill in those gaps, those deficits, and address them as best that they can. So there's no doubt in my mind that instruction is not dependent on the curriculum. Just as you can have a great curriculum and have poor instruction, because that curriculum is not dependent on what the teacher does in the classroom. Now, if the curriculum has a significant number of deficits, certainly instruction can suffer, because teachers are having to spend most of their time looking for alternative materials to support the curriculum. So, curriculum evaluations are very necessary because it does help us find those gaps in what's going on in the curriculum. And the instructional evaluation will not help us achieve that. So when a teacher goes in, and we can have a great evaluation of a teacher, and she's just amazing, and still have problems with the curriculum. And we can do a curriculum evaluation and find that the curriculum is awesome, but the way the teachers are implementing it is substandard, and the instructional strategies they use are substandard. So it's a little of both of these issues. The answer to this question is a little bit of both. We often hear that evaluation and research are interrelated ideas. For example, there are people who conduct evaluations for the purpose of a research project, and we hear people doing research in the schools that involve evaluation. So there's an interrelatedness between these two concepts. The two words are very different and should not be confused, because at the heart, when we look at evaluation, what's happening is we are making decisions and pronouncements, i.e. judgments, about something. And typically these judgments are in terms of the value of something. That's why value is part of the word. It's the root of evaluation. And so when we conduct an evaluation, what we're doing is looking to make a pronouncement about the value of a program, simply and completely. So that as we look at a program, we look at, is this program worthwhile? Is it worth our time? Is it worth our resources? So we conduct a study to gather data to help us make that decision. So we're not just stating an opinion, we are stating an observation, we are stating a fact based on observable, valid data. Research gives us that data. Research is a systematic process that enables us to gather data related to the guiding question, the research question, the hypothesis. For example, a hypothesis about a program that says that it is effective. The research is the data gathering that we do that supports that hypothesis. So, really, when we look at these two words, they're connected to each other. They're not interchangeable, but they are connected. And research is a valid part of evaluation. We need to conduct research because we need to gather data on which to base our judgments, to continue the program or to discontinue it. There is no way that I could present, or you could even read, the models of evaluation that are out there. Now, Daniel Stufflebeam has identified 22 different models and presented them in this week's chapter. I'm sorry, I don't think we need to look at 22 different models. I'm going to present you with one that's a very workable model. But we see that there are types of models that can be employed and done by any educator who's had a research course in their master's program. We have what are called the limited models, where they either assess, evaluate the objectives, or they evaluate the guiding principles of a program or a curriculum for this matter. There are also the CIPP models. Sometimes they're called SIP models, and that CIPP is the acronym for the phases of the evaluation, the areas where the evaluation is to be conducted, the context of the curriculum, the input that's given to the curriculum, the process of how the curriculum is designed, or the product, the outcome of what the curriculum is producing. So these are two models that are used very often. Your book talks about them. I'm going to give you a little bit more on the CIPP model as a part of this. Yes, there's just too many to look at. I don't think that you would have to say that one model is better than another model. These are just two models that are fairly easy to conduct. And I'm going to give you the one on CIPP simply because it's one that most everyone can do. And it's not as exhaustive of a process that it could not be done by the staff at the school and the teachers and administrators, but it also is one that can be done fairly easily, not too intrusively either. To conduct an assessment of curriculum objectives, we would look at the curriculum and we would identify all of the objectives for all levels of the curriculum. And various groups would be involved. So we'd have an elementary group that would look at, if we're doing it elementary level, we'd have a group of kindergarten teachers, first grade teachers, and all the way on up, each looking at the same thing for their grade level. So we would gather the objectives up. And the first round of the data gathering process would be to do this. Does the objective, as it's written, specify the performance that is supposed to be achieved by the end of the time limit? Secondly, does it indicate a degree of mastery? It has to be at a certain level of achievement. Finally, does the objective outline the situation or conditions under which the performance that's got to be made, so that we can be able to see these three aspects of the objective are there. Now, where do we get this data? I've indicated on the left-hand slide of this particular model, and it's a limited model, so we're looking just at curriculum objectives. We could look at lesson plans. We can observe in the classroom. We can interview students. We can even look at standardized tests to see how well the standardized tests are measuring these specific objectives. Then the evaluation part of it looks at, was the objective achieved? If yes, you create a new objective is outlined. If no, then we look for the cause, and that could be instruction. It could be the objective itself, it was poorly defined, or there weren't enough resources in order to achieve that objective. So when I'm doing a limited evaluation of the curriculum, I'm just looking at the objectives. I've got a lot of data there, and some of it is subjective data, lesson plans, observing in the classroom. But it gives me enough information that I can make a decision about, has the objective been achieved? Or does this objective need to be rewritten? Because if these objectives are not met, then you're going to see holes in gaps in knowledge for these students. So that, okay, what are you going to do to remediate these deficits? And that's why this type of assessment is great, because it is almost a formative type assessment, because it can be done several times throughout the year. And teachers can do this. Teachers can review their objectives to see if they're being met. They don't have to wait until the annual testing or the quarterly testing or end of course testing. They can do this for important objectives throughout their curriculum and use their own test in the classroom. Now, I identify here, number 4, that we're talking about standardized tests. You certainly can use those, but there's nothing wrong with looking at a teacher-made test, so long as the test is lined up with an objective, for you to gather data about whether the students have mastered the objective. Because we do these item analyses for a test we give. And basically we're concerned if the majority of the class gets number 7 wrong. But we don't seem to be as concerned if that number represents how many kids didn't master the objective. And that should concern us more. So, assessing our curriculum objectives is an excellent thing to do. And even this process, I'll add as an aside, could be done for instructional objectives. How often do we think about our instructional objectives to see if it was achieved or not? Well, we taught, so that's all the assessment we need. No, not really. How effective was our teaching? And you could look at it this way. If our teaching is more effective, maybe we'll see greater increases in achievement of the curriculum objectives. Have you ever thought about that? The linkage between curriculum objectives and instructional objectives? Because it doesn't go both ways. If the curriculum objective is achieved, does not automatically mean that the instructional objective will be met. But if the instructional objective is met, then more likely than not, the curriculum objective will be met. That's why assessment of objectives is a valid evaluation, and it needs to be done periodically throughout the school year. A second limited evaluation would involve looking at the guiding principles of the curriculum. Now, I'll set out right now that I chose the number here at the top of looking at one or two of these elements annually. And because these are very broad things, it will take a long time to do them. That's why 2 at the very most if you're a large school, because you'll have enough staffing to do it. If you're a medium-sized elementary or secondary school, you probably are only going to choose one of these. On the left-hand and far right-hand side, you see the guiding principles are there. And then there's an explanation of what that guiding principle is. For example, top left, the scope of the curriculum. That looks at how broad is the curriculum. So how much of the content that could be presented is presented. Are students receiving an adequate background in Algebra 1? Or is it too narrow? Or is it way too broad and not possible to cover in the time that you have outlined for Algebra 1? Especially if you've gone to a semester-long course where it is on a block schedule, then you may have way too much information to cover in just 18 weeks. So, assessing the scope of the curriculum may be a very valuable evaluation to look at that. And I would say over the course of 5 years, maybe 10 years, you could look at each one of these. Now, the problem with that idea, and it is just a suggestion, is that we don't stick with the curriculum long enough to really go through all of these areas. Some of this, we hope, is being done by people above us at the State Department or nationally, or it's being done by the textbook provider. You hope people are doing this. I'm less and less certain that this is actually happening because of some of the complaints that people have about the curriculum. They question about balance and relevance of the curriculum. So I don't know how much this is happening. I can only guess. So that's why you may want to look at the curriculum in these areas to make sure that it's balanced or is relevant. So any one of these you could choose and do a year-long, and it might take you a year. Maybe you could do it quicker, just depending on how many people you have involved. You could look at one of these in the fall and one of them in the spring. But ones that I think are probably the most important are going to be the scope. So how much material are you trying to cover? Secondly would be relevance. How much does this relate to kids getting into college, getting jobs, so forth and so on. Next, then I think probably sequencing of the material. would be the third most important one to go ahead and look at. Then fourth probably would be the transferability, because remember, the whole point of school is to prepare kids for life. So if the material is not transferable to a job after they leave, what's the point? So these are just some of the areas that you could evaluate in the curriculum. You would have to set up the parameters, and we can talk a little bit how we use the CIPP model to even assess guiding principles. You could use that model to help you, although it's not designed specifically for this. It would be one way to do it. Or any of the other 22 models that Stufflebeam has identified would certainly help you to look at these. I think one a year is probably all that you're going to have time for, maybe two at the most. But these are things that should be done on a regular, consistent basis. I like the CIPP model because it is broad. It covers a lot of important areas of curriculum evaluation, but it's easy to remember what to do. And it allows flexibility for each school, depending on your staff size. It doesn't really matter. You've got 60 teachers, it's not requiring you to have 120. So it's something that is easy to do with different staffing sizes. So let's look at the parts of this model. First, and as I said, it's an acronym for context, input, process, and product. You can even look at just one of these. Now, you don't have to do all four of them. That would be a pretty in-depth evaluation. So most schools that use this model on even years will do number 2 and number 4, and on odd years they will do number 1 and number 3. So odd years context, process, even years input, product. You can create any schedule that you want. Maybe just do one a year, starting with context. So it really does allow for a great deal of flexibility for the time that you have and other challenges that your staff may be facing. So when we look at context, in this evaluation, we examine the environment where the curriculum is being implemented. What's going on? Describe the school culture. Describe the climate of the school. Describe the population that supports the school. Identify then unmet needs that each of those things have within the environment. What are the unmet needs of the students? What do they need, and why isn't it being provided? So what's going on? To describe the environment. That's really what happens when we define the environment. We describe it. And as a result of that, it will help us to identify, wow, we really need to focus on remediation, and we're not doing it. Our kids are struggling in this area. Wow, we really need to focus on getting more nutritious meals or more kids to eat breakfast because it's there for them. And they're not eating, which means they don't have the nutrition that they need so they can concentrate. You see, describing the environment helps us to understand those forces that impact curriculum. Curriculum is not implemented in a vacuum. It is subject to external forces within the school and external forces from outside of the school. And therefore, we've got to be able to identify what those forces are and how they are impacting the curriculum. We also look at the goals and objectives and make sure that those goals and objectives are relevant to the context, the environment. They are relevant for this environment. We're not setting a goal that's so high these kids can never achieve it. We're setting a realistic goal that challenges them, but it is an achievable goal. So context is the first. Second is input. And in this case, we're looking at resources. So we identify the resources that we have that we can bring to bear on the objectives, to meet those objectives. What textbooks do we need? What technology do we need? Do we have all that we need in order to achieve the objectives? And this is where you're doing inventories, you're taking surveys, you're looking at materials that you're not using that maybe should be used, or materials that you have that are not related to the objectives. It also gives you a chance to look at programs that you have implemented that are no longer valid. In other words, you don't have objectives that are being addressed by those programs, and you just haven't eliminated the program. So looking at the inputs, these are the things that the school provides. You could even go so far as to say, what other things do the students need in order to be successful that maybe their parents have to provide as well. So we look at the inputs, the resources that we have. Third, we look at the process. And do we have a mechanism in place to give feedback on the curriculum? Do we have a way to gather opinions and insights from our stakeholders and what concerns they have, what concerns the teachers have, what concerns the students have? Are we getting regular feedback, input from the various stakeholding groups? Because when we get this information, we can then detect where the problems are. We may not have fully implemented the curriculum, which is why it's not doing what it's supposed to do. Or we have implemented it fully, but there are problems with the implementation. Could be scheduling problems, could be professional development problems. There may be a misalignment of expectations and objectives. So looking at the process of how the curriculum is being used will help us to identify the flaws in it. It'll also give us data that we can use to make program decisions, so that we can decide we need to stop this and do something different, or provide training that teachers need in order to successfully implement it. So we've got to look at the process for how the curriculum is being implemented in the classroom. Do teachers have a command of their subject knowledge? That's a part of the process. What do we need to do to provide them? They can't use technology if they don't know how to do it. So do we need to provide some training so that they can effectively use the technology that the curriculum needs to be in place? So again, look at the process. Finally, you can look at the product. And this really is a measure of the objectives, because we're looking at, okay, did the curriculum do what we thought it was setting out to do? And so we look at, what are the kids able to do? How are they able to demonstrate that they have mastered the objectives and the standards that are a part of the curriculum? And really what this is an examination of curriculum objectives in terms of the state standards that are required. Now, we hope that the objectives in the curriculum are one and the same with the state standards. They may not always be, but we certainly hope that they are. So, the product is the end result. We look at this through our achievement scores. We look at this through teacher observations and teacher input. What can the kids do now that they've been exposed to this information and this training? How can they perform? Well, this is just a brief, as I said, overview of the evaluation of instruction as well as the evaluation of the curriculum. Your textbook provides a lot of detail about this. I want you to have this model in your back pocket. It's one that you can do as an individual. It doesn't require a whole group to do, which is why I chose it as a way of examining the curriculum. Remember that Plato once said that the life that has been left unexamined is not worth living. I believe that the curriculum that is not examined on a regular basis is not worth teaching, because we need to be looking at it and reflecting on it. Is it doing what we want it to do? Is it meeting the objectives that we've defined? Same thing with our instruction. Is our instruction doing what we think it should be doing? Is it having the desired effect? And reflecting on that. We don't do this very often. That's why I want you people to be the ones who are passionate about, let's reflect on what we're doing. Let's think about what we're doing and make sure that we are effective in our instruction, as well as that we have provided a curriculum that meets the needs of our students. Well, I hope you have a great week this week, and look forward to seeing you online as we look at evaluation. Take care.